Hi, thanks for joining me for this video as we talk about the distinction between realism and nominalism. I think this is really important. If you stick till the end, you'll see how this really has an impact on the world today, some of the craziness that we're experiencing in the world, and how it's really important to analyze how we think, how we perceive the world around us. And that really is the crux of realism versus nominalism. Okay, so this picture just shows two people out and about observing things, looking at a tree. Something is going on in their mind as far as the way they're processing what it is, and that really gets to the bottom of what we mean between the difference between realism and nominalism. Okay, so what we're going to do in this video is talk about realism and nominalism from the perspective of four different philosophers. Okay, those are going to be the Greek philosophers Plato and Aristotle, the Italian, of course, philosopher St. Thomas Aquinas, whom this whole page is dedicated to, and then the 14th century English Franciscan friar philosopher William of Ockham, and we'll talk about his philosophy and how it really is a pretty major departure from the other three that we'll be talking about during this presentation, okay? To understand realism versus nominalism, you start with the premise that we as human beings come to know things, through our senses. Of course, that's Thomas would certainly believe that. I think everybody would, unless you're just like an extreme rationalist like Descartes who denies his senses, realize that as we go around in our life, we see things like birds and human beings and lizards, right? And we see them one at a time, right? We see, you might see 5 birds, but you see individual birds, right? And they might be in a group. And individual lizards, we perceive these with our senses, right? But universals just means what all the birds have in common, or all the lizards, or all the human beings, and is there a distinction, and do universals exist? Okay, that's really the crux of nominalism, doubting basically that universals exist. For the sake of this demonstration, we are going to talk about flowers, which we all have. We're all aware of the fact that there are flowers out there, right? I hope. Human beings, and also frogs. Okay, and I'm purposely showing 2 frogs just to highlight the fact that we know that there are multiple examples or individuals of all these different species or creatures that we see on a regular basis, right? Okay, so nothing that I've said so far probably is debatable. We observe all these things in our everyday life. All right, well, let's start with Plato. Now, Plato was a realist. In fact, he was a big-time realist in that he believed that there was something real about the things that we experience. Okay, so for example, a human being, a flower, and a frog. Okay, there's something real about a human being other than what we just perceive with our senses. Okay, there's something about real about flowers and frogs other than what we're able to experience. Okay, so Plato, as you may know, put these in another realm. Okay, that's why I'm putting them up high. So there's this frogness, the eternal realm of forms, he called it, and it wasn't part of the actual physical frog or flower or human being. It's somewhere else. So what we witness down here below, according to Plato, was just like a frog that represents the ideal form of frogness, which is somewhere else. So they're not real. I mean, they're just something that we experience with our senses. But if you want to really get to what we understand as the reality of frogs, you got to go up to that other realm. Okay, so this is Plato, kind of an interesting philosophy, and flowerness and human beingness all in this other realm. Okay, so that's Plato and what he believed. But he was a realist. He believed that there's something real about the things that we experience. It's just not part of what they are. Then we move on to Aristotle, who was Plato's student, and Aristotle was also a realist, okay, but he departed from Plato in that rather than this realm of form somewhere else other than the actual physical thing that we witness, he taught that the forms were part of what we experience. Okay, so a frog or a flower or a human being, the form was a composite. It was combined with the matter. And so when we see a frog, we're actually able to have an experience of coming to know the form through that actual frog, okay, or that actual flower, okay. So this is very different from Plato. Aristotle would be a philosopher that St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, says, yeah, I agree with this philosophy. So let's move on to St. Thomas Aquinas. And like I said, he will be in agreement with Aristotle in that the physical, tangible, sensible creatures that we experience have matter and form together, okay? So we're able to actually come to know the reality. Remember, he's a realist, okay? The reality of things through the physical creature, okay? It's not in another realm like Plato taught. But we're also going to say that Aquinas added something, because he was a Christian, of course, and he said that these forms first exist in God. Okay, so the form exists originally in God, and then God creates the world of creatures, and these forms exist in the creatures along with their matter, which means something very important. That means that we can come to know things in the created world, which tells us something about God. Okay, this is a very, very important part of what's called human epistemology. Okay, that we can actually come to know things, and by knowing them, we are learning something about God. Okay, this is very important. And then along comes William of Ockham in the next century, 14th century, right after Aquinas. They never lived at the same time. Ockham was born about 11 years after Aquinas died. So he comes up, well, he doesn't come up with nominalism, but he really perfects it and makes it much more, I guess, understandable to people. So rather than a realm of forms like Plato, or the forms existing within the material world like Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas, Occam has this novel idea that forms don't exist. Okay, there are no forms or universals. There's no frogness. There's no flowerness. There's no humanness. It's just a name we give to things. Okay, so we see all these individual flowers out there in the world, and we say, okay, that's a flower, and that's a flower, and that's a flower, but they don't have, there's not a flower nature. It's just a flower, right? And they're similar, but a little different than the turtle and the butterfly, but it's just a name. Okay, so there's no realm, there's no form, there's no universals, right? That's nominalism. Nominalism comes from the fact that we name them. Okay, so who's taking charge now? It's us. All right, so again, if there are no forms, if Occam is right, then there is no human nature. There is no flower nature, and there is no frog nature. Okay, now this is very, very unsettling, because what Thomas Aquinas would say is that when we look at a frog, its nature tells us what is a good frog? What's the goal? The teleology. What's the purpose of a frog? Okay, a frog jumps and leaps and has slimy skin and is able to swim, and there's certain things that go along with being a frog, and they all share this. All right, and we also can say, well, a good frog perfects its nature. A good frog, and again, this isn't a moral judgment, it's just saying that there's something in frogness that is guiding it towards an end. By who? By God, right? And so these two frogs are alike, and it's not just a name that we give to them. There's actually something in them, something real, hence realism. There's something real about these frogs, right? And again, if there's no flower nature, we don't know, how does a flower fulfill its nature? Okay, a flower fulfills its nature by being a really good flower. Okay, now, and again, it's not free will. I'm not talking about that. I'm just saying it's put into them by an intelligent designer to fulfill their nature, and therefore they're a good flower. And so if there's no flower nature, well, then there are also no ideas or forms of flowers in God. Okay, so that's been taken away from the formula by William of Ockham. Okay, and most principally, if we believe in nominalism, there's no human nature. All right, there's no teleology. There's no way of really knowing what is man's end, what is man's purpose, what are we here for? That age-old question that has to do with our nature. That's the way that God created us, all of us. Okay, every person in the world, all billion of them, we have a shared nature, and we have a shared purpose. And that doesn't mean we all do the exact same thing, but we're all destined to be united with God, right? Ultimately, beatitude. That's what God designed us for. But with nominalism, all that goes away. One of the great tragedies of nominalism is what happened after William of Ockham died, and in the subsequent centuries, you had this guy, Martin Luther, who was a big fan of Ockham. Okay, now of course Martin Luther started the Protestant Reformation, and we know how disastrous that's been to Christianity. And then you have somebody like David Hume, who was a ultimate empiricist. He believed that the only thing that we could really come to know were our perceptions. Okay, so again, only the senses. Throw reason out the door. Clearly influenced by William of Ockham, and of course David Hume lived several centuries later. And then it just keeps on progressing to somebody like Friedrich Nietzsche of the 19th century, who was a existentialist atheist who believed he turned against the Christian faith. You create yourself. Man is something to be overcome. All right, the Superman, the will to power. Because if you throw out if you throw out reason, if you throw out coming to know things, if you throw out purpose, well, then the will takes over, and then we become whatever we want to become, because there's no goal, there's no end, there's no telos, right? And then if you take this to its logical conclusion, you have existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre, who said, you're born with existence, no essence, and then you create yourself into whatever you want to be. Okay, there is no design plan, there's no God, there's no, and I take God out of the picture here because at least these two last guys were atheists. Okay, so does nominalism lead to atheism? I think that's a pretty good argument to make. Okay, was William of Ockham an atheist? No, he was a Franciscan friar, but ideas have consequences. Ideas have consequences, and this one was a bad idea, and it had really bad consequences. The consequence is chaos. Okay, chaos. When you throw God out, when you throw out ideas, forms, reason, you get the world much like we're living in today, where, and I don't have to give the examples, you probably know what I'm talking about. It's totally chaotic and totally nutty. And so this, in the end, concluding here, has to do with the way we perceive the world is important. And if we really want to understand it, we need theology. We need to read scripture. We need to understand our faith. But we also have to understand philosophy. Okay, we have to understand how ideas got passed down from century to century and generation to generation. Some of them are great, some of them are not so good. And I will say also, if you subscribe to nominalism, you're also not going to understand the Blessed Trinity, because God knows all things. God the Father as principle generated the Son, who is the concept in the mind of God, the Word of God. In Jesus Christ belongs all knowledge of the Father, because he is equal to the Father. And if you don't understand knowledge and how that knowledge is represented in the things that we experience in the world, well, you're going to be lost, and you're not going to understand human nature at all. Well, thank you for watching. I hope I've convinced you that nominalism is not a good path. Realism is really good, and the teachings of St. Thomas Aquinas explain realism as best as any philosopher has. And don't forget, we also are going through the entire Summa Theologia. If you'd like to join us, just go to my website, studythesumma.com, and jump in, because we're going through all of this and much more in the classes. God bless you. Thanks for watching.